your answer to the Q&A. I'll ask the question verbally so that you can all answer verbally. It might be tempting to go in and answer by text, but I'll filter the questions. And again, you're welcome to mute as other people are talking. Just, you know, be aware to unmute when you want to say something. Mm-hmm. And I think that's it. I think this is going to work well. I do think a lot of people that work in global development have used Zoom before. So.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay? I'm not using any microphone. Is it okay the way it is?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great.
Sounds fine. Good. Good, good. And the other two screens you see there are my colleagues Pratima and Donnie that say Global Law.
I don't have any earbuds either, but hopefully it's okay too. There's been a lot of wind, like it's windy, but hopefully it won't get through the microphone.
Okay. Jimar, are you in Costa Rica or where are you right now?
Yes, I'm in San Jose, Costa Rica.
Great. Good. And Sara, you're in San Francisco? Where are you living?
I'm here in Washington. I live out in North Bend with my husband.
That's right. Great. Good, good. Great.
And just a disclaimer, we're both home with my 6-month-old. So that's just the life we're living right now.
Exactly.
You might hear during the webinar.
You know, it's going to happen, and that is our new reality. I'm sure others will understand completely. So as we discussed too, as people join, they'll be on mute and not have their video available. So we should be able just to see how many participants. We do have 40 participants joining already.
Okay.
Pratima, is that right? We have 40 joining? Yeah, some more joining now. Great.
Hi, everyone. I'm trying to do the logistics part here, but I think, yeah, all of your names are set. So let me know if you have any questions. I'll be right here.
Great. Okay, I think we're going to get started. It's directly 3 o'clock. But we can get started and people will join as they come in. It does look like we have a number of participants already on the call. So we'll start. I'm Kristen Daly, the Executive Director of Global Washington. Thank you all for joining for this virtual event. As many of you know, Global Washington often convenes in-person events around specific topics in global development. And now in our new reality, we're trying this virtual event. One of the reasons why Global Washington was founded was to make connections and to build an ecosystem for global development. And we've been doing that for several years. And we do think it's really important to continue this virtual connection. I know several of you, everyone has different circumstances, but I know several of you are working from home at least. Some are even self-quarantined or shelter in place. So we believe at Global Washington now more than ever, we should provide these ways to connect. And virtually connecting, I think, is one way we can do that in this new reality. So thank you for joining us all. If you're joining, it looks like we have about 50 participants right now. We've actually had over 100 participants register for this event. And because of that, as you join, you will be muted and not able to use your camera, just so we can facilitate this conversation. I'll repeat this later on for people joining, but we do want you to ask questions of our panelists. And so later in the event, close to 3:50, we will ask you all to type out your questions using the Q&A function of Zoom that should be on your screen. The chat function is actually disabled so that we are all using just one thing. So you can wait to ask your question then, or you can type it if you have one throughout this conversation. I'll be screening the questions through the Q&A, and then I'll actually ask them verbally for our panelists to answer verbally rather than in written form. So I do want to acknowledge the fact that we are living in very unusual times, and having this event hopefully is a way for all of you to connect and also to enjoy something of content that might be unrelated to the coronavirus, something that you can really think about outside of reading the news. So we wanted to provide you that and acknowledge that these are uncertain times. Global Washington is going to be doing a series of events more related to the coronavirus, one even starting on this Friday at 10 o'clock a.m. Pacific time, that is about one of our nonprofit members who had to quickly shift their annual gala from an in-person event that they always do to a virtual event. And they're been asked how they did it and how they were so successful. They blew past their fundraising goal by $80,000. So we wanted them to come and share their lessons learned. So if you'd like to join that event, you can look at our website and find out more information. So we are tracking the coronavirus and trying to provide resources to our members. Like I said, today the topic is gender-based violence. And I've actually read recently there is a connection to the coronavirus. I think that maybe our panelists can talk about. But incidents of violence, gender-based violence in particular, always goes up during a crisis. And it is something, again, if you're feeling isolated and thinking about mental health issues, it is something that we've seen in history. So this topic is relevant for today's time as well. So let me give you a bit of background about Global Washington for those of you that don't know. And then we'll get into our questions to the panelists. Global Washington is a member organization of 165 members that do topics such as global health and climate change, economic development, many different aspects of global development issues you can think of. So the way we organize our work is each month we pick one topic that our members care about, and we produce an issue campaign. So you should have received a link to one of the issue briefs we did on this topic. And then we do feature articles also on our members that are focused on that topic, and cluster all our members around that are working in developing countries to improve lives. So we usually do an in-person event for networking and connecting, but this is our event for this issue campaign. We decided to also focus on this topic because it's related to the Sustainable Development Goals that Global Washington is really used as a framework for our issues. Again, this touches on many different aspects, but in particular around human rights and gender equity. So we're very proud to have this panel of experts here today to talk about the topic. Again, let me repeat just real briefly before I introduce the topic that for those of you that are joining, I think we're up to about 70 participants. Because we've had such a great response in joining this conference call, this webinar, we've decided for the participants to be on mute and not have their camera on during this conversation. We will be doing Q&A around 3:50, and you'll be able to use the Q&A function on the Zoom to ask questions of the panelists. I'll screen some of the questions. If we have many, we're probably not going to get to all the questions. And then I'll ask them verbally of the panelists, and then they'll answer verbally. So let's get started, and I'll introduce the panelists first and kick off the conversation with some questions. First, we have Ami Bishop. Ami, can you raise, oh, you have your name printed there, but there she is. So Ami has a background in global health and social work, and she worked at PATH for 25 years on topics such as TB, HIV, and women's health. She gravitates and usually finds herself at the intersection of global health and human rights. And today she's wearing at least two hats, but we've asked her here to represent two of the boards that she serves on. One is the organization called Rise Beyond the Reef, and the other is Outright Action International. And both have very unique perspectives when it comes to gender-based violence. So thank you for being here, Ami. Next, we have Xiomara Carballo Berceño. Sorry, I hope I said that close. She is the program officer for the Central American and Mexico Youth Fund at the Seattle International Foundation. Xiomara is Costa Rican. She's in Costa Rica right now. And she's also Afro-descendant activist who works on women's rights issue and is really known for developing strategies that are both intersectional and multicultural and working with grassroots organizations in that way. Her background includes working with UNDP, UNICEF, UNFPA, other NGOs, and other grassroots organizations. She has a law degree and has participated in diplomatic delegations to various countries around the world. So welcome. Next, we have Sara Akov, who's a senior gender advisor for CARE that's based in Atlanta, but we're fortunate to have Sara here in Washington State with us. Her experience includes monitoring and evaluation across many programs at CARE, but in particular around gender work. Prior to CARE, she worked within the US and abroad on topics including gender equity and adolescent and youth sexual reproductive health. She also worked in Liberia on ending gender-based violence during the Ebola outbreak. So thank you all for joining us today. So the first question I'd like to ask all of you is for you to tell us how your organization is actually defining gender-based violence and what aspects of gender-based violence is your organization working on. Ami, let's start with you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I know I can't see you, but thank you so much to Global Washington for organizing this really important panel and discussion. As Kristen mentioned, I'm wearing two hats. And as a long-time affiliation with Outright Action International, about 12 years, both a board and now a consultant, and being on the board of Rise Beyond the Reef. And there certainly is overlap. I think that's one of the things we need to also appreciate, that we don't want to be looking at this issue in too much of a divided way, but there are some distinct issues that relate to the populations that we focus on in each of those organizations. Starting with Outright Action International, which is a global human rights organization that focuses on the human rights of LGBTIQ people around the world, based in New York City. We, of course, are particularly concerned with LGBTIQ people who experience violence, abuse, and discrimination because of their actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. And we know well that violence against LGBTIQ people is prevalent and perpetrated often by families or partners, just as would be the case more generally. We also know that LGBTIQ people around the world face disproportionate levels of violence, and the roots of this violence are really very similar, if not identical, to those affecting cisgender women and girls. Cisgender meaning born and living in the identity that in the sex that you were assigned to at birth. So we know, of course, violence is often about power and assertion of patriarchal power and autonomy, especially when that power is challenged. It's often specifically punishing those who are seen as defying or challenging gender and social norms. We know that lesbian and bisexual and transgender women are even at higher risk due to embedded sexism, gender inequality, restrictive gender norms, and power relations within families and societies, and can take the form, just as in more broadly, the form of physical, psychological, sexual abuse. In the case of lesbian and bisexual women, we see the phenomenon of something called corrective rape. We see also, we recently did quite a large study on so-called conversion therapy that is often perpetrated by, or at least promoted by family members, and is quite violent in some cases. Just quickly, an example of the work that we do in the Philippines, and I'll talk more later about some of the other work, but we do have a program right now on enhancing protections for LGBTIQ people from family and domestic violence. And we're trying to focus both on root causes as well as addressing immediate needs. And we're working with LGBTIQ communities themselves, policymakers, and direct service providers at barangay level. If you're familiar with the Philippines, these are the sort of smallest government unit in a community that are tasked with providing interventions that can include addressing domestic and family violence happening in the community. So with LGBTI people, the work focuses on informing and enabling LGBTI people themselves to understand what their rights are, what that abuse is unacceptable, and where they can seek recourse and justice. It's about providing them with skills, I guess, and tools to kind of reclaim and fight for their rights and accessing justice and services. We're also working directly with service providers so that they can provide sensitive and inclusive interventions. And when these units have been prepared, there's an ongoing interaction with them. They're kind of designated as so-called friendly service providers. So let me just quickly switch to Rise Beyond the Reef, which was founded in 2013, and it focuses on the unique development needs of Fiji's remote rural communities. The program's primary goal is improving women's lives through ecologically sustainable income generating projects that rely on traditional skills and materials. And the work really underlyingly is addressing gender inequities and intended to create alternative platforms so that women can improve their own lives. The mainstay of the work, and this has really come out of very deep and intensive work with communities to identify their priorities, but they are primarily working on crafts, sort of contemporary arts and crafts income generation. And I should have mentioned at the start, I mean, Fiji has some of the highest rates of gender-based violence in the world. A 2011 study suggested that about 71% of women, I think, have been physically or sexually abused since the age of 15. And then Rise Beyond the Reef itself did its own baseline work in one of their target regions, a region called Yakete, where they found that 34% of women reported suffering from some sort of physical abuse in the last year. So the work really there is focusing on building the capacity of communities with a strong focus on inclusion of men, to figure out how they can use the resources within their communities and their culture to sort of change the norms and culture around gender-based violence. They definitely look at this as very long-term, deep work, working on very sensitive topics, building trust. What I really appreciate about Rise Beyond the Reef's model is that they really seek to ultimately be self-sustaining, so that they're trying not to be reliant on the cycle of funders, and really being able to engage very deeply and over the long term to address these kinds of harmful gender norms. So I'll stop there. It's hard to know exactly how to balance working with two different organizations, but I hope that answers your question to start. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks so much, Ami. Xiomara, do you want to go next and tell us how you're defining gender-based violence?
Absolutely. Thank you. Hello, everyone. And I'm very honored to be part of this panel and to be able to talk about this subject with such wonderful colleagues. Well, first of all, I think it's necessary to have a we all have like some sort of general understanding about what gender-based violence is, which is targeting women, women's integrity, dignity, freedoms, the way they exercise and relate to their rights in all of their contexts. And in our organization, it's very important for us that as we do this, we're also understanding that there are very different dimensions to women, meaning race, meaning where they live, meaning sexual orientation, disability, and all of this comes together through one element that we particularly care about, which is being a young person. So we're particularly interested in supporting the capacities of young people and young women to organize and be able to exercise their autonomy, their rights, to strengthen their political participation capacities, and particularly their their capacity to organize around social movements and around any subject that they feel that they should gather around. And having said that, what our fund, the Central American Mexico Youth Fund and Seattle International Foundation supports, it's a amplified way to provide funding to these groups and really providing a flexible environment, and providing a space where they can really lead these processes, where we are not imposing an agenda or particularly setting strategies, but letting young people letting young people be able to create the space and find the ways that they need to defend their rights and create social movements and lead the way to their own autonomy and to their own strengthening of capacities. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you for that introduction. We'll get more into that, I'm sure, later on. And I did want to thank Seattle International Foundation for co-presenting this event today. Global Washington and SIF often do events together on topics that overlap. So I'm sure several people that have joined the webinar are here at SIF's invitation as well. So thanks so much for that. Sara, let's jump to you. And again, tell us briefly about what CARE's work is around this and how you would define gender-based violence.
Thanks. So I'm going to be sharing CARE's sort of official definition of GBV, which is a harmful act or threat that's based on a person's sex or gender identity. This includes physical, sexual, or psychological abuse, coercion, denial of liberty, and economic deprivation, whether occurring in public or in private spheres. So CARE International, and I work for a part of CARE USA, has roughly 1,000 projects a year globally, many of which have some elements of either GBV integration or are explicitly focused on gender-based violence. So we work across the entire humanitarian to development continuum, and then we also have some elements of GBV programming in that nexus zone. The work that we are doing around GBV is both within the primary prevention areas, which is to say that these are initiatives or projects or programming that are situated in focusing on transforming gender norms towards greater gender equality such that gender-based violence does not happen in the first place. And those are largely kind of situated in our development programming. And then we also have secondary prevention programming, which is to say GBV response, or ensuring that those who've experienced gender-based violence have access to the care and support that they need. And a lot of that secondary prevention work that CARE has is more situated in our humanitarian portfolio in terms of humanitarian camps or other types of emergency settings. This isn't to say that CARE doesn't have programming that is situated in the primary prevention or gender norm change part of the continuum in our humanitarian portfolio, because we do, or that we don't have secondary prevention programming in our development portfolio. It's just kind of to say that most of it is in one and most of it of the other is in humanitarian. There also are a number of projects that CARE has that are not necessarily explicitly focused on gender-based violence at all. So these might be projects that are explicitly focused on food, nutrition, and security, or WASH, or education, and they have integrated elements of Gbv risk mitigation into their programming. So, for example, out of the 1,036 projects that CARE had for its last fiscal year, 51% of these reported that they had integrated gender-based violence in some way into their programming. So thinking about different protective factors, different risks, and different ways that the project can address those through various protocols or different strategies. In addition to that sort of broad spectrum of primary prevention, secondary prevention, CARE does have some specific niche work in ending child early and forced marriage. We have several projects that are focused on that particular area of gender-based violence. And then outside of that sort of traditional on-the-ground community work and community programming that we do and support along with partners globally, CARE does a significant amount of global and country-led advocacy work. So these could be initiatives that are focused on a specific country to, for example, pass legislation around the age of marriage, for example. Or it could be global work that's happening alongside a coalition of partners to address more structural elements that underpin experiences or the perpetration of gender-based violence globally. And one example of that could have been our recent support to the advocacy work around the ILO Convention on Sexual Harassment. So really, really broad, very big portfolio of gender-based violence prevention and response work at CARE. And I support some of those initiatives and some of that work, and we'll be speaking a little bit later on in the webinar about some of those particular projects and programming strategies.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Thank you to all of you to kind of set the context for this conversation. So I have a few other questions. Ami, I want to start with you next. Can you talk a little bit more about the misconceptions that people have around gender-based violence? Oh, Ami, can you unmute?
Sorry, yes, of course. Again, I'll talk first maybe from the perspective of Outright and then more specifically about Rise Beyond the Reefs perspectives on this. So I think that perhaps not surprisingly to you all knowing my where I'm coming from, for me, and I think for our field, the biggest misconception about gender-based violence is that it's only or should only be about cisgender women and girls, and that somehow the issues of LGBTI people are separate and distinct, and particularly lesbian, bi, trans people and gender non-conforming people. I think that the time has really come that we need to be looking at a much more holistic kind of approach to gender-based violence. I think another misconception, or let's say belief, maybe not misconception exactly, is that in the same way that women have historically been blamed for bringing violence on themselves, that LGBTI people, LGBT people deserve somehow to be discriminated against, treated with less respect, that they're bringing the abuse upon themselves because they're not conforming to traditionally accepted norms and behaviors. I think, the reality is in this, specifically about how LGBTI people are included or not included in the conceptual approach to GBV. And the reality is that there really is hardly any attention on the issue of gender-based violence as it affects gender and sexual minorities in the broader field. It's starting to be mentioned. I've seen a little bit more mention in documents. I don't see, not that I see everything everywhere, but I don't see a lot of substantial engagement by mainstream organizations doing gender-based violence. And I really hope and believe that that will probably change. The other thing is, I think it's important to point out, and Siamara mentioned the whole issue of intersectionality, and that violence is in this sense just one dimension of a whole range of issues facing this population that increases their vulnerability to violence, whether it's poor health or poor access to care, housing, and job insecurity, increased levels of substance abuse and alcohol use, which is unfortunately a characteristic. And then, of course, the whole issue of HIV, which is sort of a whole topic in and of itself. But the other thing I just quickly also want to mention is what is a little bit distinct, and what people, again, maybe not exactly a misconception, but something to be considered, is that violence against our populations is also fueled by criminalization. So 68 countries in the world criminalize being homosexual. 45 of these laws apply to women. 50 something, I can't remember, 53 or something like that, countries have laws that prohibit things like cross-dressing or in some way sanction transgender lives. And violence for sure is being fueled by these laws, from rhetoric coming from political leaders, from faith communities, and when people don't have recourse. So when they seek help, they simply may be re-abused. There's very little reporting because people are scared to come forward and report because they don't feel that their stories will be believed, or that their lives will be valued in the same way. So we really struggle with a lack of data. We know from work that we did some work in 5 countries in Asia that suggested we're looking at violence, family and intimate partner violence in lesbian, bi, and trans women in particular, that there was a very close correlation between general gender inequality and additional oppression of lesbian, bi, and trans women. We are also currently working with grassroots partners in China, in Sri Lanka, the Philippines, and the Caribbean, to start doing this more inclusive work, to at least demonstrate the way forward about how this work can be done in a more inclusive way. We're working with Caribbean partners, for example, on a project called the Frontline Alliance, Caribbean Partnerships Against Gender-Based Violence, engaging, similar to what I described in the Philippines, first responders, local government officials, and also policymakers, specifically on looking at improving policies and protocols through research and training and the like. I could go on. One other thing on this topic too is that building alliances across different efforts. So for example, in Sri Lanka, we're working closely with a group of feminist women and women's rights organizations that have not traditionally included lesbian, bi, and trans people in their focus, but we're now working with them to take that more inclusive approach. So in terms of Rise Beyond the Reef, just quickly, I talked with the executive director just the other day about this, and Janet Latawa, who's a force of nature, and she was saying, that from her perspective, one of the biggest misconceptions around this work is thinking that the biggest priority to all women is this issue. And it's not that it's not a priority, but it goes back to the point of kind of addressing it in isolation of other contextual factors and issues may not get you where you want to go, essentially. That again, this kind of taking a much more intersectional approach is really essential. And I think, she and her work, she feels that their work has really demonstrated that when women do have greater, for example, economic security, which is the area that they're working on primarily, that there is more shared decision-making in the homes, that they really are making headway on sort of individual agency and social relations and social structures, which I think actually speak to some of CARE's framework and pillars. And then finally, I related to this sort of not looking at the issue too singularly, something you pointed out, Kristen, at the beginning, is that major crises really have a serious impact. And in the Pacific specifically, before the pandemic started, it was climate impacts, weather events, really catastrophic weather events are putting pressure on communities who are on the front lines. And they have data that really demonstrate with those cataclysmic weather events, such as the cyclone Winston in 2016, they definitely saw spikes in Fiji specifically, but likely elsewhere, in gender-based violence, in the same way that you would see it in war zones and other kinds of crises. So I think, I guess maybe part of my answer is we can't just be looking at this issue in a singular fashion.
That's great. Thank you, Ami. And I know within the next hour, we're not going to be able to touch on all these topics. Obviously, you're highlighting the complexity of this issue and the need for comprehensive solutions and alliances. I think that's really important, and the complexity of each angle that you all are addressing. Thank you for that. Xiomara, I want to ask you next, from your perspective as a funder from Seattle International Foundation, how do you work with partners, your grantees, and have you seen successful partnerships, and how are you creating space? You mentioned this a little bit in your opening remarks in terms of being flexible and creating space for this, but can you talk about that a little more? What do you feel a good grantee relationship would be, and how as a foundation are you looking at this topic?
Yes. Well, drawing a little bit on what Ami was saying, it's very important to understand the different contexts in which we are working with, which is Central America, as you know, Honduras, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Belize, and Mexico. So we are talking about very restrictive spaces and existing in all of these intersectionalities as well, and in contexts where there's a lot of repression and there's definitely not a lot of a civic space for different strategies to be developed. So we are partnering with, we really make it a point to create a relationship, not just a basic relationship, so to speak, in terms of funder and grantee, but to really become partners in a horizontal relationship where there's trust, where there's where we are speaking to each other on a regular basis on this ever-changing context, which actually include, and we actually touch a little bit on that, like emergency contexts, which are really an everyday condition in our environment. We have very unstable political context that can change from one day to the other, and on top of that we have different kinds of emergencies, thinking of like climate change, for instance, and now the health emergencies. So having said that, what we have seen that's proven a really successful strategy is to provide this accompaniment, for instance, and around sexual and reproductive rights. And I just really, before I go into that, I want to mention that there are certain safety issues, which is why I'm not going to be mentioning particular countries or grantees. And this might sound a little bit general, but for instance, regarding abortion, which is very, very restrictive in Latin America, in Central America, there's basically no space for advocacy at a legal level, or like there's not much hope for legal changes in the close or short-term future. So we have really seen how the youth is leading and creating these strategies where they're still informing their communities about sexual and reproductive rights. They're still finding strategies to exercise their autonomy in terms of their sexuality and owning their bodies, regardless of having a change made in the law. And I just want to quickly refer to another example that I think really speaks to that in terms of pursuing law changes. And I don't want to I really want to make sure that it doesn't sound like I'm minimizing this kind of advocacy, but I'm really trying to talk about the context that we're working on. For instance, we have very organizations that are youth-led, they're actually challenging the use of these changes in laws, which we have actually seen that they have, in a lot of cases actually, have been working against the women or the people that they were supposed to protect. So we have partners that are challenging this kind of thinking, that this is the only way to achieve changing, and that changes, and that there are actually other ways that we can put into place that we might not be thinking of, but that are already happening. And this is what we want to provide space for.
That's really great. You are really helping to create that civic space that doesn't exist there right now, it sounds like, in Central America, and partnering to allow that to happen, and helping to create movements. So that's fantastic. Sara, let me move to you. As you mentioned, CARE has a variety of programs all over the world working on this issue, and both Xiomara and Ami talked about very localized solutions. But can you talk about some practices and some interventions that you find promising to end gender-based violence?
Sure. And I'm in the interest of time, I'm not going to be touching on everything. CARE does have a really excellent platform for practitioners called our Gender in Practice Primer, and I can share out that link afterwards for those that are interested, where we've kind of pulled together all of our resources and evidence around different subject areas, including gender-based violence. So if you're interested in learning more, doing a deeper dive into anything that I'm going to touch on here, I really encourage you to go there. It's a really wonderful platform that's managed by a colleague of mine. So we are starting to see, based on the evaluations and ongoing monitoring and evaluation that we're doing in our programming, some signs of promising approaches and practices. And I'll list sort of four main areas or four main approaches, and then I'm going to kind of hone in a little bit on two of those. So the four that we're really starting to see where there's some traction or some movement in terms of gender norm transformation, and then specifically, changes in attitudes and reported practices and experiences of gender-based violence, are inclusive and accountable institutions being one sort of area, and fostering those different entities and working around good governance, working on leadership and collective action, social norm change, and strengthening relationships and solidarity. So as I mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit more about social norm change and strengthening relationships and solidarity, but you can get more information about those other two on the primer. So for social norms change, I think that this is something that a lot of practitioners in this space, whether you're working on gender-based violence or larger gender or social change issues, are starting to see a little bit more of. At CARE, our social norms work is something that was really pioneered and led by a great colleague of mine who's unfortunately no longer with us. But our work is really focused on how we can adapt what was largely formerly in the academic or the academia space and translate some of the learnings that were coming out around social norms and measuring social norms change in a way that practitioners like myself and colleagues in the field could unpack a norm and identify its key components such that programming could be tailored to address those different elements to support the change around the behavior itself. So what I mean by that is, let's say you have a project that's working on ending child early and forced marriage. Well, child early and forced marriage is the practice or the behavior, but there's so much around social norms and the different elements of empirical and normative expectations and these very sort of heady concepts, as in addition to things like social sanctions and exceptions and different key reference groups for that behavior and that target group, that kind of all piece together and interface to create what is a social norm around a particular element or behavior or practice like child early and forced marriage. So to help project teams and individuals like myself who appreciate some of these more academic elements and theoretical aspects of social norms, like work on these different issues, CARE developed this framework called the SNAP, the Social Norms Analysis Plot. And it essentially helps project teams to kind of pull, as I mentioned, these different pieces apart and identify ways that projects can be tailored and adjusted to speak to those different elements of a social norm. It also provides guidance about how a project can kind of look to start to see when a particular crack or opening might be happening within a particular norm. So let's say we're talking about mobility and limited mobility for women and girls being hindered or reduced. There might be exceptions around that in instances where a girl needs to go to the market or she needs to go and access health services or the like, and sort of looking at the different pieces underneath that exception and how those can be sort of leveraged or worked with to increase the space of that particular opening. So that's some pretty interesting, exciting work that's been happening at CARE. We've been doing that for a few years now. This approach and like many other pieces around it have been piloted in a few countries. And there's some learning that's posted on the website and another one that we have around that work. The other piece that, and I'm also going to be highlighting a couple of projects that have been working on that as well. But before I get to that, the other approach that I wanted to talk a little bit about is our work to strengthen relationships and solidarity. So this approach really supports the fostering and support to strong relationships, family relationships, intimate partners, peers, and also the larger community. And this is all like how we move towards greater gender justice. Specific practices or activities that we work on at CARE are our village savings and loan associations, solidarity organizing for marginalized populations, engaging men and boys as equal partners, and then also working with men's support groups that are really focused on equity. So kind of unpacking those different elements of like strengthening solidarity in relationships, but also really recognizing that oftentimes when we talk about engaging men and boys, it's like, well, we're engaging men and boys as perpetrators, or there's a framing around it that is very negative and not framed in a way that is focused or inclusive or recognizing the equal experience of men and boys in many ways as partners in prevention, but also largely invisible experiencers or survivors of violence themselves. So just kind of recognizing that all those elements need to be considered and included in an approach that's seeking to foster more solidarity and strong relationships. So I mentioned that there's a few projects that I wanted to highlight that are incorporating some of these approaches. We have a project in Rwanda that recently ended called the Indashikiro Project. This was a project that was very much focused on fostering strength and solidarity with couples through a 5-month-long sort of couples counseling platform. And the curriculum for this particular counseling approach is built on lots of learning and evidence from previous care projects as well as others, including journeys of transformation, the SASA approach, and CARE social action and analysis platform. And essentially, couples within this project, over 21 different sessions, were kind of brought through these different modules, thinking about reflecting on power and power dynamics and relationships and negotiation and communication. And then at the end, some of the individuals that were included in these counseling sessions were also trained to be activists in their communities. Really promising results from this particular project. The evidence has actually just been cleared to be released publicly, that we saw a 55% reduction in the odds of women reporting physical or sexual intimate partner violence at the end of the project, and a 47% reduction amongst men for the same. There were also noteworthy reductions in forced and coerced sexual activity, and improved relationship quality, better communication, greater trust. I mean, the notable improvements that were reported from the individuals that participated were almost unbelievable. When a lot of us were looking at the evidence that came out of the final evaluation, we were kind of knocked our socks off. So really exciting findings there, and something that we're looking to think about how we can replicate maybe at scale moving forward. We also have our Tipping Point project, which is a child early and forced marriage project. This is entering into its 3rd phase this summer. It's implemented in Nepal and Bangladesh, and it really focuses on addressing the root causes of child early and forced marriage, promoting the rights of adolescent girls within communities, and really building an evidence base so that this information can be lifted up globally and used as an advocacy tool. The project is really focused on community participatory analyses and how that can feed into how programming is designed and implemented. There's a lot of work that's really focused on girl solidarity and solidarity groups, and how we can kind of mobilize adolescents to be part and drivers of their own change stories. And then in addition to these aspects of sort of collective solidarity and agency, there's also a component of the project that really seeks to foster better relationships between adolescents and their parents, which is a really important component, and goes back to that dynamic of key reference groups that I talked about. The last project, and I'm finishing up here with what I wanted to share, is a project called Saja, and this is a project that I actually support in the Bihar province of India. And this is actually one example of a secondary prevention project that we have for GBV. There's a 2-pronged approach to this particular project that focuses on increasing access to support and services for survivors of intimate partner violence. So this particular program works to support frontline health workers who are largely experiencing gender-based violence, and specifically intimate partner violence themselves, to sort of identify this violence in their own lives, and also the different power dynamics and aspects and social norms that underpin it first. Because so often we are asking frontline workers and others in the community to take action against gender-based violence without recognizing that they themselves are also experiencing this. So we're starting here first and working with these communities of frontline health workers and Ashanwadi workers. And then later on in the project, they'll be trained to be able to provide strong and good referrals to their clients if those clients sort of self-disclose. While we're doing that work with the frontline workers, we are making sure that the services that we plan to refer survivors to later in the project are starting to, improve, and they have adequate support and capability and capacity to respond to those survivors when they come in, and of course those that are already coming into the health facility. So working on provider trainings and ensuring quality of service delivery in those areas as well. So that's just a little taster of some of the things that we're working on at CARE. Some really exciting work happening globally, and some really interesting findings coming out of some of the initiatives that CARE supports with partners. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. That was really, really good to get specific on those. So thank you. So I have one last question for the panelists, and then I'm going to open up questions from the audience. So again, use the Q&A function on Zoom. If you can, please direct your question to one of the panelists so we can get more questions in. And you can also say your affiliation in the question if you would like. You don't have to. So if you type those in, and again, I'll be screening the questions and then asking the questions verbally for verbal responses. But my last question for the panelists, that we'll do maybe rapid fire so we have enough time for the questions from the audience. Tell me if you're optimistic about the future or not. And I know it might be a hard question given the topic and given the time of history we're in right now, but you all have been working in this field for a long time, and you have seen the ebbs and flows and actual following some of these movements that have come up all over the world. So I wanted to hear from all of you if you're optimistic, and if so, why? And if you could do just briefly answering that. Ami, can you start?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Boy, it's when it's first of all, let me just say it's easier for me to be in Seattle, Washington, and say, oh yeah, I feel optimistic. But I think that really, truly, the brutality that exists in the world is sobering, and now, of course, with this pandemic crashing down around us, I think that we can assume that the stress and the social disruption that it's causing is really going to lead to increases in violence in the short term. But I mean, stepping back from this moment, I do think that in some contexts, and I certainly can't speak to all in any way, but in my experience where I've worked, there are signs of changing social norms for women, for girls, and even for LGBTI people. I mean, if we look at the work sort of coming from the other side of HIV work, it's actually because of the HIV crisis that visibility and needs of queer communities around the world, saw the light of day under difficult circumstances, obviously. But I think the issue is that we really need data. I also think, and this is kind of a little bit of a maybe counterintuitive, but the reason I think that we're making progress is that there's a lot of backlash. There's a lot of backlash going on in the world with more regressive laws being proposed, and but I think it's a sign of actually because people are making their voices heard, and in all sorts of ways, and young people especially. And I think that the way forward, as I said, is really to be working in solidarity with one another across issues of women's rights and LGBT rights, racial justice, climate justice. We have too much at stake to stay siloed. And the very last thing I'll say is that I think we probably all agree that violence and abuse and discrimination of LGBTI persons in particular is not really solely the concern or problem of LGBTI people or women only. It's a problem of entire societies, of men, of families, and we all need to be grasping this and moving towards respecting human rights and autonomy and dignity and equality, for societies to thrive. So.
Great. Thank you. That was a good response. It was a bit of optimism, but a lot of realism. So that's very good. Xiomara, you want to go next?
Yes, I think it's very important to recognize that we are in this changing context again, and patriarchy, as we move forward and as we have seen progress towards ending gender-based violence and other issues. there's also, as we are transforming and creating these changes, so is patriarchy. Like we need to understand that patriarchy is also like this evolving creature that will adapt to the changes that we make. And I think at some point some of these adaptations even might seem progressive, but we need to be thinking ahead of that and like really exercise our vision towards where we need to go. And in those terms, I think it's very important that we continue to adapt and to continue to look very closely. And I am to look very closely at this adapting strategies. And I am optimistic about the present and of course the future, because I think it's a process that we are even able to observe in ourselves, like where who we were as a person, as we exist in the world, and as an individual, and also as part of a community and different communities, and how we have been able to empower ourselves, and how do we exercise our own rights, and how do we exist in our own bodies. And as long as we continue to support that empowerment and that autonomy, we're also going to become elements of change wherever we go and wherever we are. So of course, we have to be optimistic about that and about our own transformation and what that means for the different communities that we exist in, and what not only who we work with and for, but who we are in the world. So I am optimistic, and of course, there's no time to surrender to the monster of violence. So we will continue for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much. That's great. Sara, do you have a few brief remarks on this as well?
Sure. I mean, I would say that of course I'm optimistic. I wouldn't just keep working at this for over a decade if I didn't think that there was hope for all of us. That said, I think that it's something that we're constantly having to raise up in terms of its importance, and in terms of investment for global programming. And I think one of the challenges that we often face with GBV programming is pressures from donors and others sometimes to kind of prove that the work that's happening on the ground and amongst collectives and with movement builders and social movements is having an effect. And things like RCTs can be really challenging within those types of environments, because it's really difficult to ask about experiences of GBV in a ethical and do no harm way. So it's kind of balancing that optimism that I have, and also the realities of the challenges of this sort of work that we support from an operational perspective and from a measurement perspective. And I would just say, personally, I just had a baby girl 6 months ago, and to think that she may grow up in a world where this is still a very big part of 2/3 of the world's populations of women's lived experiences is something that I really can't go to bed at night thinking about. So, I'll continue working on this as long as I can. And I know there are many here on the webinar and here on this incredible panel that are also doing really hard but important work to hopefully have a day where individuals aren't experiencing this type of violence.
Great. Thanks, Sara. Okay, I'm going to turn to some of the questions from the audience. It looks like we have quite a few so far. So I'm going to start with this one and first ask Ami to answer this. Question is, some people believe efforts to reduce GBV cannot succeed in the absence of economic empowerment efforts. What are your thoughts around this?
Yeah, I think it's hugely important. I'm actually currently, so here's a third hat I wear because I also do independent consulting. And Sara, I didn't know you used to work in Liberia, but I'm working in Liberia right now with the LGBT coalition. And one of the, and it's very much a sort of civil society strengthening oriented program. And their feeling, their own set of priorities really has made clear that economic development, livelihood options is crucial for them to be able to gain autonomy and a voice. And so embedded within a range of different kinds of work we're going to do with them will be actually also looking at economic empowerment. I think the issue for LGBTI people in particular, there is underemployment, unemployment, lack of education. People get bullied out of schools, so they don't have necessarily the kind of formal training and skills to be able to get employed, and they've been perhaps kicked out of their families. And so it's a whole cycle that really pushes or keeps people in poverty. So it's essential.
Great, thank you. I'm going to keep going through some of these questions, and if I turn a question to someone else, you can go back and comment on other questions if you'd like. But I think this is an interesting one for Giamara. It's a question that says, what do you think is the role of the youth movements and young leaders in terms of advocacy for our rights for a gender violence-free life? So a little bit more.
Could you please repeat the question?
Yeah, it's around somewhat of what you were talking about, but what is the role of youth movements and young leaders in ending gender-based violence and in terms of advocacy?
What is the role?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely an interesting question. I don't think it's something that we should define what the role is. I think it's a matter of finding, like, youth finding that role and how they want to take that lead. And we, speaking from a funder's perspective and donors' perspective, it's our role would be to provide a companionship to as that process develops. So definitely, we're not here to define what their role is. We just want to provide a safe space for youth to define that role.
That's great. No, thank you very much. And this is a question, Sara, I'm wondering if you have comments or Ami, but because Ami brought this up, it's a question around suggestions for organizations to better integrate ending gender-based violence into projects when the staff might not have expertise in the matter, and context that they might not be widely available for governments or nonprofit service providers. Sara, do you have comments on that first?
Yeah, I do. And this is something obviously that we talk about a lot and program around a lot with our extensive portfolio of programming that is not explicitly focused on GBV. So we do have a set of guidance that came about around 2014 to support programmers and project implementers that are not explicitly focusing their projects on gender-based violence. So as I mentioned before, an example could be a food, nutrition, and security project, or an education project, or a WASH project. And the goals are really kind of catered to those elements, but recognizing that gender-based violence is pervasive and happening in the communities within which CARE is implementing projects. Project implementers do need to have some tools and guidance and resources available to them. So we did develop this guidance to kind of help support that work and really root those guidance and ethical and ethical considerations, as well as do no harm approaches. So that is available for those that are interested. All of CARE's materials are publicly available for anyone that wants to use them. And I'm currently working actually on a toolkit that will accompany that guidance that kind of unpacks some of the GBV risk mitigation components. So it can be really challenging. There are aspects of GBV risk mitigation that should absolutely be done by a GBV expert, 100%, because the risks of doing further harm are significant. I think a good way of putting it is that the opportunity for getting it wrong is about as big as the ocean, and the opportunity for getting it right is about the size of a small runway. So there is a lot of room for doing further harm, unfortunately. So this guidance is really critical and important. But there are resources out there. CARE has some, and there's plenty of other organizations that are also doing some interesting GBV risk mitigation work.
That's great. Thank you. I may have another question for you, or you can piggyback on that one as well. This is probably wearing your outright international hat. How can we ensure the safety of those working on addressing social norms, especially local advocates?
Yeah, well, similar to Xiomara's answer earlier, I think it is those people, the activists on the ground, that need to provide the guidance about how others work with them to ensure safety. And it's very much also does piggyback on what Sara was saying, in that the opportunity or the possibility of doing harm is actually quite considerable. And so the very first thing one must do is follow the lead of the communities with which you're working, to understand and to avoid or mitigate the possibility of harm. And so that's just paramount.
That's great. Xiomara, you can add to that if you like. And I also have another question for you from a participant. The question from the participant is, how do we do GBV work that breaks down the patriarchy, as you said, while at the same time preserving the richness of our beautiful cultural fabric among families in countries like Latin America and among Latinx American communities here in the US?
Yeah, in regards to providing safety, I think it's a work of analyzing every case and what those particular needs are. We have to give like particular examples. We have provided like security cameras, where we've gone from providing security cameras to providing cybersecurity technology or training, and like they're very different aspects. And it also goes hand in hand with that communication that I was talking about earlier, and how we find this this communication where our partners, our grantees, are able to tell us about what they think their needs are, and we try to be very good listeners and find a way in how we can meet those needs, and how we can help them with meeting those needs. And the other question was, how do we fight gender violence while preserving cultural diversity and beauty? Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In the Latin American, yeah. Well, I thinking maybe that question refers to cultural diversity, and how some of the interventions that donors and funders and organizations do might be somehow in conflict with community and traditional norms. And I definitely think that it's a very, it's quite the challenge, because at the same time that you want to eliminate harmful practices, you don't want to disrupt the 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 culture, the right of people to live their cultural traditions and life. So I don't think I have a specific answer to that, because as this person said, as the question said, our diversity is, it's very, it's bigger than we can imagine. So we can't have one formula to do that. But I would say that it's very important to be listening, actively listening, and establishing horizontal relationships with the people that we work with, and never impose an agenda on what we think it's culturally appropriate or not.
Right. No, I think that's a great answer. And I think you have answered this throughout, of forming that partnership and understanding the grantees in a very inclusive way is the right way. Let's see. Sara, I have a question for you first, and then maybe Xiomara can answer as well. The question, and I want your perspective, it's what recommendations would you give funders to best support violence prevention? So from CARE's perspective, what do you think a funder can do to best support your work? And Xiomara, maybe you can reiterate some of your points as a funder as well.
Sure. So I think for me, and I'm speaking sort of as an individual who works for CARE, and also somewhat for CARE as well. So I recognize that this is being recorded, but also want to just like found my answer in that framing. I think I'd really love to see, I mean, some of our funders are incredibly flexible. The Tipping Point project that I mentioned has an incredible donor that is really collaborative and recognizing that there is a lot of opportunity for learning that kind of falls outside of the more rigid parameters of traditional monitoring, evaluation, and learning. I think some of the things that we can learn most about in terms of GBV prevention and response and you know what works really kind of falls into the qualitative realm. So really supporting initiatives that use those types of methodologies and participatory approaches for MEL with programming. I also think that it's really important to have a more long stand of, you know, a longer viewpoint in terms of donor cycles. I think sometimes it's really challenging. Let me rephrase, it's always challenging to have a project that is incredibly short and we're sort of being asked to implement and start up and then finish and show evidence and show impact in a short period of time, especially when you're talking about things like gender norm change and social norm change. So having a longer term view and having a longer implementation period is really an opportunity to kind of work with the community over an extended period of time, work with a cohort of people over a longer period of time, and really start to see those elements of social change and community mobilization and collective action really start to take root. A couple, like just to summarize, you know, have more flexibility, focus on qualitative methodologies, think through a longer term donor cycle, if at all feasible, to allow for longer periods of project implementation. And just recognize that, especially when we're thinking about asking individuals about their experiences of GBV, that's a tough one. So having impact and goals that are kind of rooted in ending or reducing violence, that's really hard for us to measure as programmers because of the ethical considerations around that. So thinking more about norm change and increasing access to services and some of those other things that we know are important and critical, while also not putting survivors at an increased risk of re-experiencing the trauma and the violence that they've already had to go through.
Great, thanks. Xiomara, do you want to answer that as well?
Yes, it is definitely very important that as donors, we also work together as a network, because there's a lot of similarities, a lot of and a lot of similarities in terms of the partners that we work with, or the countries and the contexts that we're working with. And it's definitely, there's definitely a lot that can be done when working together as funders and donors, in terms of making things, facilitating the work of the organizations, not only by obviously providing the funding, but making the reporting so much easier, or having like a common report, which is something that we are trying to we've been thinking of and trying to implement, for instance. And I always keep in mind that our place is to not occupy the organizations in writing a report, but rather allowing them to continue to do the work that they are already doing. So it's very important to create those networks, to listen to each other, and to really look closely at the different contexts. Because for one country, it could like their organizations working on a network might work wonderfully, but in other contexts that might not be possible because of political differences, for instance. And really understand that there's no one formula to apply for everyone, and to just check ourselves and each other as we are doing this support work. And also, we understand that it's very important, for instance, the matter of M&E, monitoring and evaluation. And also, we're as a funder, we're trying to start the conversation about how there are non-traditional ways of looking at these changes and looking at these evaluations, and trying to be very creative about the way that we get to see the sprouting of these changes and impacts, and try not to be very too rigid and too traditional about this, which is very important, particularly for us being a youth fund. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Ami, I have a question for you that's pretty specific. It says, do you have any experience in responding to forced marriage in LGBTIQ people? Oh, Ami, can you unmute?
Yeah. It's actually a huge issue, and I think it's difficult to say that we have experience responding to it. I think what we have experience with is working with communities who have ways of trying to intervene, or who can support those women who manage to find ways out. I was, and I think that actually is an extremely common situation, whether it's forced marriage or it's simply marriage because there's no other option. And for bi and lesbian women, I mean, I was just reflecting on where I'm working right now in, I won't say where, but youngish woman who, and this also speaks to some of all the intersecting issues, but you know, she herself, when she was, first of all, subjected to female genital mutilation, she was, when her mother suspected that she might be lesbian, she was forced into a marriage at age 16. She fled that marriage. She was beaten. I mean, the whole, and now she's actually formed her own organization, and is trying to work with women who are in that kind of predicament of one sort or another, but in terms of forced marriage in particular. But here's the thing. Because her organization is really sort of gearing towards working with lesbian and bi and also trans women in other areas, she has an incredibly difficult time getting any support or funding because it's just off the radar. It's not considered sort of gender-based violence in the mainstream way. So to the person who asked the question earlier about advice to donors, please, if there are donors on this call, please consider being more inclusive in your definition and in your support for work that spans the spectrum. I think it's really critical. There are a lot of people who are trying to do this kind of work that are unable to really attract funding locally. But I'm wandering a little bit from the original question, but I think it's a huge issue, and I think it's best addressed, of course, within specific cultural contexts. Outright works very closely with partners in a lot of different countries who are doing that work.
That's great, thanks. I'm going to try to bundle a few questions together, and hopefully I'm getting the right intent. Several questions talk about the need to work through traditional legal structures. And when those aren't available, as you've all talked about, or when that breaks down, what are people supposed to do? And how do you prevent from being discouraged and seeing re-victimize of survivors? And how do you work on this issue with undocumented migrants or people in refugee camp where there's very little structural outlet for them or a route for them to go through? So I know that might be a big question for the last one, but Sara, do you want to have a few comments on that? Again, how do we work on these issues when there is no legal structure or the structure is not suited to actually protect the survivors?
Yeah, this is a hard one. And, in my limited experience, I've seen it both ways. So there are instances in which the legal infrastructure is insufficient to protect survivors. And there are instances in which survivors wish to seek services, for example, medical or clinical services, and they can't do so without seeking some form of legal redress. And they do not want to do that. So they don't go and access the services. So it can happen both ways, and that's a big challenge that we do face in response work and multi-sectoral approaches to GBV response. I think that this also goes back to the question that was raised about how do you integrate GBV risk mitigation into your programming, and I think that in those instances in which the legal infrastructure or any infrastructure related to GBV response are insufficient, we as practitioners do have a responsibility of doing due diligence and thinking about what that referral network can look like. Certainly if referrals are made to services, whether they be legal or medical or otherwise, and those services are not of quality, the risk of re-victimization is incredibly high. So the challenge that we're faced with is thus do nothing, because that's potentially better than doing further harm. And as those that are trying to ameliorate the lives of those individuals, that's a really hard thing to struggle with. Speaking of hard, my husband's trying to soothe the teething 6-month-old, so apologies for the crying in the background. Yeah, as I was saying, I think that this is really challenging, and I'm not sure that myself as a GBV person that's working as a program supporter or designer has really figured it out. And I think it's something that we at CARE are talking about a lot, and trying to figure out what is the most appropriate move, what is the most appropriate way to support survivors in the best way possible, what is as an ethical do no harm approach. And I think that unfortunately a lot of the steps necessary to validate or ensure the quality of services for those places that we're referring survivors are so involved that many programs do not have the capacity to do that. So if then what? And that's something that I'm currently working on with the toolkit that I mentioned.
Great.
So I'm sorry, I wish I had a better answer.
there is no right answer. So thank you for your insights. Xiomara, do you want to add anything to that?
Sorry. Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Yeah, it is. And you've touched on this again. When there is no reliable legal structure for people, for survivors, how do you remain optimistic, and how do you work around the system?
Yes, thank you. I think I'll have to go to the creative part again. For instance, we have been the CAMI Fund has been providing some emergency support for some of these issues that arise as emergencies and political crisis, and that has been supporting some of the issues that might arise in a context like that. I think it can't be a long-term solution because it doesn't really matches the sustainability and the changes that we wanna see, but it's definitely a way of bringing down the anxiety and like really making the context more livable, for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm.
And which is what we have been implementing, but it's definitely a challenge. And I would say that it's very important that understand that there are a lot of strategies that communities have been putting into place already, and we always want to go back to that, and like things surviving and resisting strategies have been put into place since ancient times, and communities will always find their way to that, whether there's laws or not. And that's what we want to support, and that's what we want to encourage.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. Ami, any final comments on that question as well?
Well, only to say that it's particularly acute, and just what Xiomara is saying, a lot of communities, marginalized communities, LGBT specifically, are finding ways to set up their own safe houses and their own ways of providing support kind of underground, at least in the immediate. That's really the addressing the most acute and immediate need. But in terms of long-term, it's a different story. They're actually, I mean, we don't have time to go into it, but Outright actually does a lot of work at the United Nations level, working with regional and even the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights and activists to get more documentation about violence. And this is broad beyond violence specifically targeting lesbian, bi, trans women, for example, but getting it into universal periodic reviews for countries. And so I think sort of documentation is also really crucial in the long run. It doesn't immediately meet the needs of survivors, certainly.
Right. Well, we're at the end of our time. I think that last question actually helped summarize a few of the points in terms of this is a very complex issue. It's going to need comprehensive solutions that both protect survivors in the immediate and create those movements in that social space, and also create long-term structural change. And that's and changing social norms that are long-term. So I think you all have touched on all those points for this the past hour and a half. Thank you so much. At this point, I would tell people to join me in clapping and thanking our panelists. But thank you from thank you on behalf of all the participants. I do apologize, we did not get to all the questions. If you would like to email Pratima Stanton that you got this email from and share your question again, then we can pass that on to each speaker, and they can answer the question privately and just directly with you via email. So sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but thank you for participating. I'm glad that we could do this topic. It's a critical topic of our day. So thank you all, and please stay safe, stay healthy out there, and you can always look at Global Washington's website for future events. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.